Susan Ross's death remains one of television's most iconic jokes. But off camera, it wasn't a stroke of dark comedy. It was a cold-blooded purge orchestrated by Hollywood's most exclusive secret club. Because leading man Jason Alexander couldn't handle his scene partner's acting style, the Seinfeld elites didn't just fire actress Heidi Swedberg. They wrote a script to literally kill her off with toxic envelopes, turning a working woman's real-life job loss into a national punchline. This is the brutal truth behind television's most fake romance. The roots of this disaster trace directly back to the American television industry in 1992. The sitcom format was changing rapidly. For decades, comedies were safe. They relied on warm families and moral lessons. Seinfeld was the exact opposite. It was a show built entirely on cynicism. The characters were selfish. They spoke with a very specific, rapid-fire rhythm. By the fourth season, the four main actors had built a massive wall around themselves. They operated like a closed club. They traded jokes with incredibly fast timing. Breaking into that established rhythm was terrifying for any outsider. The pressure on these actors was immense. They were not just performing. They were carrying a billion-dollar corporate asset on their shoulders. The network executives watched every single rating point. If a joke failed, the actors felt the immediate heat from the top. Jason Alexander was riding a massive wave of success, but that success came with a deep, hidden terror. He knew that his entire financial future and his identity in Hollywood relied on his comedic timing. He was playing George Costanza, a deeply neurotic and frantic man. Jason needed complete control over his scenes to make that character work. He lived in constant fear of losing his edge. Into this high-pressure cooker stepped Heidi Swedberg. She was cast to play Susan Ross. Susan was a wealthy television network executive who would become George Costanza's girlfriend. On paper, the network thought the casting was perfect. They needed a serious, grounded woman to stand next to George. They needed a straight man for his frantic comedy. Heidi was perfect for the job. She was not a sketch comedian. She was a working-class actor with a traditional theater background. She approached her craft with serious discipline. She needed the paycheck, and she was grateful for the steady work. She planned to show up, learn her lines, and do exactly what the director asked. The collision happened on the very first day. The professional disconnect between the two actors was absolute and immediate. Heidi approached the character of Susan with total sincerity. She delivered her lines straight. She did not try to fish for laughs from the live studio audience. She played the reality of the scene. She treated the script like a real conversation. Jason Alexander worked in a completely different universe. He was a highly theatrical performer. He relied heavily on physical momentum. He viewed sitcom acting like a violent tennis match. He needed his scene partner to hit the ball back with equal speed so he could build his rhythm and land the punchline. When the cameras rolled, Jason threw massive amounts of frantic, neurotic energy at Heidi. He expected a volatile, fast reaction. Heidi responded with a calm, understated delivery. It completely destroyed his acting process. Jason hit a dead end. He felt like he was throwing himself against a solid brick wall. He could not predict how she was going to deliver a line. He could not anticipate her reactions. For an actor who survived on precision and speed, this unpredictability was pure torture. In a normal, healthy work environment, this problem is easy to fix. A veteran actor and a director simply pull the new cast member aside. They sit down, have a coffee, and work through the timing. They find a middle ground so both people can succeed. But the television studio was not a healthy environment. It was a ruthless corporate machine. Time was money. The shooting schedule was brutal. There was absolutely no time for patience. There was no room for mentorship. The studio simply demanded a finished tape by the end of the week. Because of this pressure, Jason did not view Heidi as a colleague who needed a little guidance. His insecurity took over. He viewed her as a massive threat. He genuinely believed that her slow, serious acting style was going to ruin his performance. He felt exposed under the bright studio lights. He felt she was making him look untalented in front of the network executives. The process of filming devolved into a weekly nightmare for him. He dreaded driving to the studio when he knew she was on the daily schedule. His trauma was rooted in the fear of losing his status, and he directed all of that fear right at his scene partner. Heidi Swedberg was operating in a completely different reality. She was entirely isolated from his rising panic. She was just doing her job. She learned her lines perfectly. She hit her marks on the floor. She delivered her performance exactly as she had been trained. Nobody pulled her aside to tell her there was a problem. The directors did not ask her to speed up. Jason did not talk to her about the rhythm. She was entirely unaware that her quiet, professional approach was making the leading man miserable. She thought she was doing a great job playing a serious executive dealing with a crazy boyfriend. The most bitter twist in this entire situation was how the public reacted. When those early episodes aired in 1992, the audience loved the dynamic. Viewers watched the scenes between George and Susan and found them hilarious. They saw the extreme stiffness. They felt the lack of warmth. They noticed the sheer awkwardness radiating from the television screen. The public assumed this was all deliberate. They thought it was a brilliant acting choice by two talented professionals. They believed they were watching a masterful portrayal of a couple who were completely wrong for each other. The audience was completely fooled. They were not watching the brilliant execution of a comedy script. They were watching a genuine breakdown of human communication. The awkwardness they laughed at was real. It was the raw, unfiltered discomfort of a leading man who could not stand the woman standing opposite him. The network executives realized this immediately. They saw that the real-life friction was generating massive ratings. They were successfully monetizing a hostile workplace. They sold Jason's genuine misery to millions of people as high-concept comedy. Meanwhile, Heidi remained completely alone. She was the center of a major television narrative, but she had no friends on the set. She was a temporary employee in a building run by millionaires. She did her work and she went home. She did not know that the awkwardness the audience loved was actually building a target on her back. She did not know that Jason Alexander was reaching his breaking point. The lack of communication on the set was a ticking clock. The leading man was tired of suffering in silence, and he was preparing to use his immense corporate power to protect his own ego, no matter what it cost the woman standing next to him. By the time the calendar turned to 1993, the silence on the sound stage was becoming unbearable for Jason Alexander. The television show was no longer just a popular comedy. It was quickly transforming into a cultural juggernaut. The stakes were incredibly high. Every single episode generated massive amounts of advertising revenue. With that kind of money on the line, the pressure on the actors to deliver perfect performances was crushing. Jason felt this pressure more intensely than anyone else. His character, George Costanza, was the neurotic heart of the show. If his timing was off, his character failed. And if his character failed, Jason risked losing his position in the brutal Hollywood hierarchy. He could no longer suffer in silence. He felt that his scenes with Heidi Swedberg were dragging him down, and he decided to take action. He did not handle the situation like a professional colleague. He did not knock on her dressing room door to talk things out. In the corporate structure of a television studio, a leading star does not negotiate with a guest actor. The star goes straight to management. Jason used the immense privilege of his rising fame. He went behind closed doors to speak with the producers and the head writers. He laid out his complaints clearly. He told them that acting opposite Heidi was like punching a brick wall. He explained that she did not give him the comedic energy he needed to survive in the scene. He framed the situation very carefully. He did not just say he disliked her. He told the executives that her acting style was actively hurting the comedic momentum of the show. He made his personal discomfort sound like a financial threat to the network. The executives and the writers listened to their star. They looked at the situation through the cold lens of a corporate balance sheet. They knew that sitting both actors down, bringing in a director, and taking the time to fix their working relationship would cost valuable production time. In television, time is millions of dollars. Fixing the problem required empathy and effort. Getting rid of the problem was free. The network executives made the easiest, most ruthless choice available to them. They decided to protect their leading man and throw the guest actress away. They agreed to write the character of Susan Ross out of the show entirely. The execution of this decision was swift and completely heartless. Heidi Swedberg showed up to work to do her job. She had memorized her lines. She had hit all her marks. She had caused zero drama on the set. But in Hollywood, doing a good job does not protect you if the star wants you gone. The writers handed the cast a new script where George and Susan broke up. The breakup was abrupt and cynical. On the television screen, it looked like just another funny storyline about George ruining a relationship. But in reality, it was a literal firing. Heidi Swedberg lost her job that day. She lost her steady income. She was a working-class actress who relied on those paychecks to survive in an incredibly expensive city. Losing a recurring role on a massive hit show is a devastating financial blow. And the most cruel part of the process was the silence. Nobody told her why she was being written off. The executives did not give her a performance review. Jason did not look her in the eye and explain his frustration. She was simply handed a script that ended her employment. She packed up her belongings and walked off the studio lot. She had to accept the harsh reality of her industry. If you are not part of the core group of stars, you are entirely disposable. When Heidi left the set, Jason Alexander felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The heavy burden of trying to act opposite someone he could not understand was finally gone. He walked back onto the stage and reunited with his three main co-stars. The fast, aggressive, comedic rhythm returned immediately. He felt safe again. He was back in his comfort zone, surrounded by people who spoke his exact comedic language. He went back to making millions of dollars, fully believing that he had permanently solved his problem. He thought he would never have to see Susan Ross again. This is the dangerous illusion of being a television star. You think your power is absolute. You forget that the network only cares about your comfort until they find a way to make more money from your misery. 2 years passed. The show grew even bigger, dominating the television ratings. Jason was comfortable and secure, but behind the scenes in the editing rooms, the writers and creators were reviewing old tapes. They were looking for new storylines for the upcoming 7th season in 1995. When they watched the old footage of George and Susan, they did not see a failure of communication. They saw absolute comedic brilliance. They realized that Jason Alexander's genuine frustration, his sweating, his panic, and his sheer misery translated perfectly to the screen. The head writer, Larry David, understood a dark truth about comedy. It is deeply funny to watch a selfish, neurotic character suffer. The writers realized that the worst possible thing they could do to George Costanza was to trap him. They decided that breaking up with Susan was a mistake. The real money was in forcing George to marry her. They crafted a massive season-long storyline where George gets engaged to Susan and immediately regrets it. The network executives loved the idea. They knew an engagement storyline would guarantee massive ratings and huge advertising payouts. They did not care for a single second that their leading actor had begged them to fire this woman 2 years earlier. Ratings and revenue completely erased Jason's workplace comfort. When Jason Alexander was handed the outline for the 7th season, he experienced a moment of pure, unadulterated horror. This was not a quick guest appearance. This was a 22-episode commitment. He was staring at a full year of working every single day with the one person he had actively tried to banish from his life. But he could not say no. This is the brutal trap of a Hollywood contract. He was locked into a legal agreement that paid him an astronomical amount of money. If he refused to perform the storyline, he would be in breach of contract. The network would sue him, freeze his pay, and potentially destroy his reputation in the industry. He was a multi-million-dollar hostage. He was forced to smile, accept the script, and prepare for a year of absolute professional misery. On the other side of town, Heidi Swedberg received a phone call from her agent. The hit show wanted her back. They were offering her a massive storyline. For a working actress, this is the ultimate dream. This is financial security. This is industry validation. She naturally assumed that the producers loved her previous work so much that they simply had to bring her back. She had absolutely no idea about the toxic reality waiting for her. She did not know about the secret complaints Jason had made. She did not know that her return was Jason's worst nightmare. She accepted the job with gratitude and professionalism. When Heidi walked back onto the studio lot in 1995, she was completely blind to the danger. She smiled at the crew. She greeted her scene partner. She was ready to work. Jason smiled back, but behind his eyes the resentment was already boiling over. He was furious that his corporate power had failed him. He was furious that he had to share his screen time with a woman who broke his rhythm. The cameras started rolling for the 7th season. The scenes they filmed were incredibly tense. George Costanza was desperate to find a way out of the engagement. He sweated, he lied, and he panicked. The audience sitting at home roared with laughter. They thought Jason Alexander was giving the comedic performance of a lifetime. They did not understand that he was barely acting. The desperation on his face was real. He was a man trapped in a long-term contract, looking at a co-star he desperately wanted to fire, forced to pretend they were planning a life together. The network had successfully trapped two people in a completely fake romance, built entirely on hidden resentment and the cold reality of corporate contracts. The environment was a ticking time bomb, and the real cruelty was just beginning. The return of Heidi Swedberg to the studio lot in late 1995 marked the beginning of a profound and suffocating psychological isolation. She walked into the production facility of the most profitable television show in the world. She had secured a massive season-long contract, but she was entirely alone. To understand how a professional working actress could be so completely frozen out of her own workplace, it is necessary to examine the strict, unforgiving power structure of the set at that specific moment in time. By the 7th season, the main stars were no longer just actors reading lines. They had evolved into a massive corporate monopoly. They were negotiating record-breaking salaries and generating billions of dollars in future syndication revenue. Because of this extreme wealth and unprecedented industry power, they formed a tightly closed circle. They operated as an elite fraternity. They shared their own private inside jokes. They ate meals together in secluded areas. They rehearsed using a rapid private shorthand that only they understood. They built an invisible, impenetrable wall around themselves to keep the rest of the industry and the rest of the crew completely out. Heidi Swedberg was firmly placed on the cold side of that wall. Jason Alexander was the primary architect of her isolation. He was legally trapped in his storyline, forced to act out a prolonged engagement with a scene partner he could not understand, but he refused to accept his misery quietly. He could no longer simply walk into the producer's office and demand she be fired. The network had locked the engagement plot in as the central anchor of the entire broadcast season. Since he could not physically remove her from the building, he decided to completely destroy her reputation within the core group. He initiated a calculated daily campaign of passive-aggressive manipulation right on the studio floor. He used his elite status to poison the well. After a frustrating take, Jason would not offer Heidi a polite suggestion or attempt to work through the scene like a professional colleague. He would simply wait until she walked away. Then he would turn to his powerful co-stars. He would throw his hands up in the air in mock defeat. He would complain bitterly about her timing. He would sigh heavily and ask his wealthy peers how he was supposed to do his job when he was acting against a solid wall. He carefully planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the most influential people in the room. He actively framed Heidi not as a fellow actor, but as a heavy anchor dragging the entire comedic momentum of the show downward. Whenever a joke failed to get a massive laugh from the live studio audience, Jason made sure the blame silently shifted entirely to Heidi. If a scene felt slow during a rehearsal, it was subtly declared to be her fault. She became the ultimate silent scapegoat for any minor failure or drop in energy on the set. Jason used his immense influence to ensure that the entire core cast viewed her presence as a massive inconvenience. It is a terrifying reality to watch a powerful man use his own professional frustration to slowly turn an entire room against a woman who is simply trying to do her job. Heidi Swedberg lived this grim reality every single day of the production schedule. She was a highly intelligent woman. She could feel the freezing temperature in the room the moment she walked on set. She could see the frustrated sighs and catch the subtle eye rolls when she delivered her lines. She knew with absolute certainty that she was not part of the club, but she was trapped by the exact same corporate contract that trapped Jason. She needed the work. She was a working-class actor who did not have the luxury of walking away from a massive paycheck simply because her coworkers were unfriendly. So she put on psychological armor every single morning. She drove to the studio, hit her marks on the floor, and delivered her performance with unwavering professionalism. She never threw a tantrum in her dressing room. She never complained to the tabloid press about her treatment. She endured the silent hostility and the passive bullying because that is what actors outside of the elite circle are forced to do. They swallow their pride to keep the network executives happy and keep their paychecks clearing. She maintained her dignity while the men around her lost theirs. The executives at the television network watched this isolation happen in real time. The directors saw the eye rolls during rehearsals. The producers heard Jason Alexander complaining loudly in the hallways. The corporate suits saw a woman being systematically frozen out and blamed by her coworkers. But the executives did absolutely nothing to intervene. They did not pull Jason aside and instruct him to act like a mature professional. They did not offer Heidi any directorial support or human resources protection. They simply looked the other way. The corporate logic driving this silence was brutal and mathematically precise. The engagement storyline was a massive, undeniable hit. The television ratings were breaking historical records every Tuesday night. The advertising spots during the broadcast were selling for millions of dollars. The network looked at the toxic bullying environment developing on their soundstage and decided it was a perfectly acceptable price to pay for global success. They allowed a hostile workplace to thrive because fixing it would have interrupted the massive flow of money. They let Jason Alexander turn a professional television set into a high school cafeteria where the unpopular girl is shunned by the elite kids, and they paid him millions of dollars to maintain that environment. This atmosphere of constant passive bullying created a highly dangerous pressure cooker. Jason had successfully convinced himself that working with Heidi was an absolute disaster. He had spent months convincing the other stars that she was a fundamental problem. But a whisper campaign and eye rolls are not enough to get an actor fired when they are central to a billion-dollar plot. For Jason to finally escape his contract and rid himself of his scene partner, he needed the other stars to truly feel his pain. He needed the rest of the elite circle to suffer the exact same way he claimed he was suffering. That moment of shared suffering was rapidly approaching. The writers were busy typing up new scripts in their offices. The storyline of the season was advancing toward the wedding. Soon, George Costanza would not be the only person interacting with his fiancée on camera. The protective bubble keeping the other stars safe was about to burst. The rest of the ruling class on the set was about to be forced into direct comedic combat with the woman they had been taught to resent. And when that finally happened, the passive complaints in the hallways would quickly mutate into a permanent corporate death sentence. In the television industry, the weekly table read is not a casual rehearsal among friends. It is the most terrifying room in Hollywood. It is a high-stakes, ruthless corporate presentation. On a specific morning every week, the entire cast, the head writers, the directors, and the powerful network executives gather around a massive conference table. The actors sit down with their thick binders and read the brand new script aloud for the very first time. There are no costumes to hide behind. There are no studio lights, no sound effects, and absolutely no editing to fix a bad performance. It is a raw, immediate test of the dialogue, and the actors, the executives from the network, sit in the back of the room. They cross their arms and listen closely. They are listening for the rhythm. If the actors hit their marks, the jokes land, and the room laughs, the script moves forward to production. Millions of dollars are approved. But if a scene falls flat, the tension in the room becomes suffocating. If the executives do not laugh, the writers are forced to stay up all night completely rewriting the episode. The table read is the beating heart of the sitcom machine. And in early 1996, this cold corporate conference room became the exact setting for a career execution. For the vast majority of the 7th season, Jason Alexander had carried the heavy burden of the engagement storyline almost entirely on his own shoulders. The writers had deliberately structured the episode so that his character George Costanza interacted with his fiancée in isolated scenes. They were usually alone in an apartment or a coffee shop. Jerry Seinfeld and Julia Louis-Dreyfus, the other major stars of the show, had rarely been required to engage in heavy, direct comedic interplay with Heidi Swedberg. They had certainly listened to Jason complain bitterly behind the scenes for months. They had stood in the hallways and heard him vent his absolute frustration about her acting style. They had heard him use the famous brick wall analogy. But hearing a coworker complain is profoundly different from experiencing the frustration firsthand. The other stars simply thought Jason was being overly dramatic. They knew he was a highly neurotic actor who worried about everything. They assumed he was exaggerating the difficulty of the situation just to get attention. They felt secure in their own comedic timing, completely unaware of the threat sitting on the other side of the studio lot. That comfortable assumption completely shattered during a pivotal table read in the early months of 1996. The writers had delivered a new script that fundamentally shifted the dynamic of the show. The storyline finally required Susan Ross to step out of George's shadow. The script demanded that she have extensive direct comedic interaction with the characters of Jerry and Elaine. For the very first time since the engagement began, Jason Alexander was not the only one acting opposite her. His protective barrier was permanently removed. The rest of the exclusive inner circle was suddenly forced to share the heavy lifting. The actors sat down at the large table, opened their binders, and the reading began. When it was time for the crucial scene, Jerry Seinfeld and Julia Louis-Dreyfus launched into the dialogue with their signature rapid-fire delivery. They were the masters of this specific television format. They threw their intense comedic energy across the table, fully expecting Heidi Swedberg to bounce it back with the exact same frantic rhythm they had spent 7 years perfecting. They expected a high-speed tennis match. Instead, Heidi responded exactly as she always had. She delivered her lines with a quiet, grounded, theatrical sincerity. She played the scene straight. She did not try to be funny. She refused to adopt their frantic pace. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The comedic timing in the room instantly died. It was like watching a speeding car crash directly into a concrete barrier. The specific bouncing rhythm that defined the massive success of the program hit a dead end. The jokes simply did not land. The dialogue felt incredibly clunky and forced. Most importantly, the network executives sitting in the back of the room did not laugh. They sat in heavy, uncomfortable silence. For the very first time, Jerry and Julia experienced the exact agonizing frustration that Jason had been warning them about all year. They threw the comedic ball, and she did not throw it back. They finally felt the brick wall. When the table read concluded, the atmosphere in the room was incredibly tense and deeply awkward. The core cast had just experienced a highly uncomfortable professional failure in front of their corporate bosses. They hated feeling out of control. Following the reading, the three main actors and the show's creator, Larry David, quietly packed up their things. They left the studio lot and went to a local diner to decompress and discuss the disaster they had just barely survived. Jason Alexander sat at the diner table waiting for validation. He knew they had finally felt his discomfort. He knew he was no longer alone in his misery. The conversation that took place in that diner is a chilling example of how elite workplace power dynamics operate behind closed doors. Jerry Seinfeld and Julia Louis-Dreyfus did not defend their guest star. They openly admitted defeat. They looked across the table at Jason and validated every single complaint he had ever made over the past year. They confessed that it was absolutely impossible to play off of her acting style. They admitted that they could not find a rhythm, that her delivery completely halted their comedic momentum, and that they had absolutely no idea how to make the upcoming scenes work on camera. The dynamic of the workplace bullying completely shifted in that exact moment. It was no longer just Jason's personal passive-aggressive resentment. It was no longer just one neurotic actor complaining in the hallway. It was now a unified, active consensus among the absolute ruling class of the production. As long as only Jason suffered, the rest of the cast and the television network were perfectly willing to force him to endure the storyline. His pain was an acceptable cost of doing business. But the exact moment the other A-list stars were inconvenienced, the exact moment their own performances and their own egos were threatened, the guest actress became an intolerable corporate liability. The stars sat in the diner, picking at their food, venting their shared frustration. They were trying to figure out how to survive the remainder of the television season with a co-star they simply could not understand. Julia Louis-Dreyfus, deeply frustrated by the disastrous reading and staring at a seemingly inescapable contractual storyline, leaned forward over the table. She made an offhand, exasperated comment. She looked at the group of powerful men and said something to the effect of, "Don't you just want to kill her?" She meant it as a hyperbolic expression of actor frustration. It was a dark, cynical joke born entirely out of workplace exhaustion. She was simply saying she wished the character of Susan Ross could magically disappear, so the core cast would not have to deal with the awkwardness on set anymore. She was venting, but she was not telling that joke to ordinary people. She was telling it to Larry David. Larry David was the showrunner. He operated with a notoriously dark sense of humor. But more importantly, he held the absolute power of life and death over the television scripts. He was the man who decided what went on the air and who got fired. When Larry David heard that sentence, he did not just laugh at a funny joke. A light bulb went off in his head. He realized that Julia had just handed him the ultimate solution to their massive multi-million-dollar corporate problem. They had painted themselves into a corner with the engagement storyline. The audience expected a wedding. They could not just break George and Susan up again. They had already done that storyline years ago. They needed a permanent exit strategy. Larry David realized they did not have to write a messy, complicated breakup. They did not have to fire Heidi Swedberg through traditional human resources channels or negotiate a quiet exit. They could use their absolute narrative power to literally execute the character on national television. A casual, frustrated joke made over a meal instantly transformed into a unanimous corporate death sentence. The fate of Heidi Swedberg's career on the show was permanently sealed in that diner. Her firing was driven entirely by the egos of a core cast who simply refused to adapt to a different acting style. And it was validated by a corporate system that firmly believed the comfort of its wealthy stars was worth destroying a working woman's job. The transition from a casual, cruel joke in a local diner to a legally binding television script is a terrifying demonstration of unchecked corporate power. When Larry David heard Julia Louis-Dreyfus suggest they simply kill the character of Susan Ross, he did not just laugh and change the subject. He took that raw, frustrated comment and walked it straight back into the writer's room. In any normal corporate environment across America, if a group of wealthy executives decides they do not like the personality of a lower-level employee, they have to follow a process. They have to document poor performance, consult with human resources, and offer severance packages. But the television industry operates entirely outside the boundaries of normal workplace ethics. The writers on a hit sitcom possess the absolute power to play God. They decided to permanently and violently erase an employee from their fictional universe. They wrote a literal death sentence to solve a staffing problem. But in the highly cynical, self-absorbed world of this specific production, a normal, respectful exit would not suffice. The writers did not want Susan to simply move to another city for a new job. They did not want George and Susan to sit down and have a mature mutual breakup. They wanted a definitive end, and more importantly, they wanted it to be funny to them. The writers engineered a demise that was specifically designed to be degrading. They decided that Susan Ross, a highly successful and wealthy television executive, would die from licking toxic glue on cheap wedding invitations. The plot mechanism they chose was deeply revealing. The writers rooted the cause of death directly in George Costanza's defining character flaw, his extreme, pathological cheapness. He refused to buy the high-quality envelopes, opting instead for the cheapest, oldest stock available. On the surface, the network public relations team would later frame this to the press as a brilliant piece of dark comedy. They called it the perfect, logical culmination of George's selfishness. But if you look closely at the power dynamics operating on the studio lot, it was a deeply cruel, passive-aggressive corporate execution. It was a calculated way for the writers to terminate Heidi Swedberg's contract while turning her actual firing into a literal punchline for the rest of the cast to laugh at during rehearsals. Imagine the psychological reality of being Heidi Swedberg in the spring of 1996. She did not receive a phone call from her agent warning her about the shift in the storyline. The network executives did not invite her into a boardroom to respectfully explain that the creative direction of the show was changing. In the cold, mechanical process of television production, she simply arrived at work and was handed the new script for the season finale by a production assistant. She took the heavy binder back to her isolated dressing room, opened the pages, and began to read. She read the dialogue where George complains about the price of the invitations. She read the stage directions dictating how her character would lick the envelopes, begin to feel dizzy, collapse on the floor, and be rushed to the hospital. And then she read the final scene where the doctor announces she is dead. That stack of paper was not just a script. It was a brutal, non-negotiable termination notice disguised as stage directions. She was reading the exact details of her own firing. For a working-class professional, the realization of what is happening in that moment is profoundly isolating. Heidi Swedberg was a highly intelligent woman. She knew exactly why she was holding that script. She knew that she had never missed a day of work. She had never forgotten her lines, and she had never caused a single argument on the set. She knew she was being killed off strictly because she did not fit into the exclusive, wealthy country club that the four main stars had built for themselves. She realized that the people she had spent the entire year working with had conspired behind closed doors to destroy her job, and the network had officially approved it. Yet faced with this ultimate professional humiliation, Heidi Swedberg displayed a level of discipline that completely shamed the men who had orchestrated her downfall. She did not march into Jason Alexander's dressing room and scream at him. She did not leak the story to the tabloid newspapers to ruin the season finale for the network. She accepted the cold, hard reality of the Hollywood hierarchy. She understood that fighting a billion-dollar corporate machine was impossible. She put her script down, walked out of her dressing room, and went to work to film her own corporate execution. The atmosphere on the soundstage during those final days of production was incredibly chilling. The studio floor was filled with lighting technicians, camera operators, makeup artists, and directors. Everyone in the room knew exactly what was happening. They all knew this was Heidi's last week, but the machine simply kept moving forward. There was no sentimentality. There was no respect for the fact that a woman was losing her livelihood. When it came time to film the actual death scene, the cruelty of the setup was undeniable. Heidi had to sit at a coffee table under the hot studio lights and repeatedly lick the envelopes. She had to act out her physical deterioration while Jason Alexander sat just a few feet away watching her. Jason knew that he had won. He had successfully complained his way out of a legal contract. He had used his elite leverage to crush a supporting player. As he watched her pretend to pass out, the overwhelming feeling radiating from him was not sadness for a departing colleague. It was pure, unadulterated relief. He was finally free. Heidi Swedberg played the scene perfectly. She delivered the physical comedy required of her. She collapsed exactly when the director told her to collapse. She gave the television network exactly what they demanded of her, right up until the very last second. When the director yelled "cut" on her final take, there was no grand farewell. The network executives did not come down to the floor to shake her hand and thank her for helping them generate record-breaking ratings all year. The crew simply moved the cameras to the next setup. She was treated exactly like a broken prop that the production no longer needed. She was quietly swept off the stage. The filming of Susan's death is a permanent stain on the legacy of the program. It exposes exactly what the Hollywood system values. The network executives were perfectly willing to completely humiliate a dedicated professional woman simply to avoid having an uncomfortable conversation with their leading man. They allowed Jason Alexander's personal ego to dictate their human resources policy. They proved that as long as the star is comfortable and the jokes are delivered on time, the absolute destruction of an outsider's career is entirely justified. Heidi Swedberg walked off the studio lot for the last time, leaving behind a group of incredibly wealthy people who were silently counting down the minutes until they never had to look at her again. The trap was sprung, the employee was terminated, and the network prepared to broadcast this execution to millions of unsuspecting viewers. For the corporate executives at the television network and the elite core cast members, the broadcast of Susan Ross's death was a massive unqualified triumph. They had successfully navigated a major human resources crisis, completely eliminated a scene partner they despised, and they managed to do it without losing a single viewer or attracting any negative press. In the immediate aftermath of the May 1996 finale, a strict, unspoken code of silence fell over the entire production. The network public relations machine was incredibly efficient. They ensured that all subsequent interviews regarding the shocking plot twist focused entirely on the creative bravery of the writing staff. The actors stuck to a carefully rehearsed corporate script. Whenever journalists asked about the decision to kill off the character, the cast praised the dark comedy of the situation. They called it a genius stroke of anti-television, proving that their show was willing to break all the traditional sitcom rules. They completely deliberately omitted the hostile workplace dynamic that had actually necessitated the firing. They essentially built a massive vault, locked the truth about Heidi Swedberg inside, and threw away the key. This absolute silence was easy to maintain because the financial incentives for secrecy were astronomical. The show was transitioning from a weekly primetime hit into a global syndication empire. It was generating billions of dollars in revenue. Every single person involved in the upper echelons of the production was becoming unfathomably wealthy. When people are making that level of money, they do not ask uncomfortable questions about how a supporting actress was treated behind closed doors. The corporate hierarchy protected its own, and the reality of the cruel, passive-aggressive campaign waged against Heidi was buried beneath a mountain of syndication checks. Heidi Swedberg herself completely understood the terrifying reality of the Hollywood power structure. She did not go to the press. She did not attempt to expose the toxic behavior of her former colleagues. She recognized that launching a public battle against the most powerful, beloved cast on American television would be absolute professional suicide. The media in the late 1990s would have destroyed her. They would have framed her as a bitter, jealous actress, trying to cash in on the show's massive success. She accepted the brutal terms of her industry. She took the massive public humiliation of her character's death packed up her life and quietly stepped away from the vicious, high-stakes ecosystem of network television. She allowed them to keep their secret, choosing personal peace over a public war she knew she could never possibly win. For nearly 2 decades, the corporate cover-up was flawlessly executed. The viewing public continued to consume the reruns, laughing at the toxic envelopes, entirely unaware of the cold-blooded corporate purge they were watching. The legacy of the program seemed perfectly secure, cemented as an untouchable masterpiece of modern comedy. The actors moved on to other projects, but they remained television royalty. But the fundamental flaw of a cover-up orchestrated by highly successful, powerful people is that absolute power eventually breeds absolute arrogance. When an individual is surrounded by extreme wealth, heavy security, and constant validation for 20 years, they begin to lose their grip on basic social awareness. They forget what is an acceptable, funny anecdote and what is actually a confession of severe workplace bullying. This specific, blinding arrogance led directly to the collapse of the 20-year secret. In the summer of 2015, Jason Alexander appeared as a guest on a highly popular, nationally syndicated radio program. He was relaxed, completely comfortable, and operating under the strict assumption that he was an untouchable television legend. When the radio host asked him to explain the famous, shocking death of Susan Ross, Alexander did not stick to the carefully rehearsed corporate script that had protected the show since the 1990s. He felt so entirely immune from consequence that he decided to simply tell the unvarnished truth. Sitting in the radio studio, broadcasting to millions of listeners, he casually admitted everything. He stated plainly that the actress was let go because he found it completely impossible to act opposite her. He publicly used the infamous brick wall analogy to describe her professional abilities. He detailed the private diner conversation where he, Jerry, and Julia sat around complaining about how difficult she was. And most devastatingly, he proudly recounted the exact moment when Julia Louis-Dreyfus casually suggested they just kill her off, and how Larry David immediately implemented the death sentence. Alexander told this story with a light, jovial tone. He was laughing. He genuinely thought he was sharing a hilarious behind-the-scenes anecdote about the quirky, fast-paced realities of producing a hit comedy. He entirely misread the room. He fundamentally failed to understand that the culture had shifted dramatically in the intervening 20 years. The public reaction was instantaneous and fiercely negative. Listeners did not hear a funny story about creative writing. They heard a wealthy, powerful man casually boasting about how he and his elite group of friends conspired to destroy a working woman's career simply because she did not match their preferred comedic rhythm. The media immediately picked up the quotes, and the story exploded across the internet and television news networks. The illusion of the brilliant, harmless comedy was violently shattered. The public looked at the beloved cast and suddenly saw a clique of ruthless, entitled bullies who treated supporting actors like disposable trash. The backlash was severe enough that Jason Alexander immediately realized the catastrophic error he had made. The protective shield of his sitcom legacy was cracking under the weight of his own hubris. Within hours of the radio broadcast generating massive negative headlines, he was forced into a state of absolute corporate panic. He drafted and published a lengthy, desperate public apology on his social media channels. In his statement, he aggressively backpedaled. He praised Heidi Swedberg as a kind, gracious, and absolute professional woman. He tried to claim that the fault was entirely his own, stating that he was simply too insecure and uncoordinated to understand her brilliant acting choices. He repeatedly apologized for dragging her name back into the spotlight and for framing the story so poorly. He begged the fans not to attack her and insisted that the cast truly loved her. But a forensic reading of that public apology reveals its true cold nature. It was not a genuine expression of deep remorse for his actions in 1996. It was a panicked, highly calculated piece of damage control executed by a man who was terrified that his public image and his future earning potential were being permanently stained. He was not sorry that he had used his immense power to have a colleague fired in a humiliating manner 2 decades ago. He was only sorry that he had been foolish enough to accidentally confess to it in public. The apology could not put the toothpaste back in the tube. The damage was permanently done. The truth had finally bypassed the corporate PR machine, and the public finally understood the bloodless mechanics of the television industry. The legacy of a toxic set is incredibly difficult to erase once it is exposed. The story of Jason Alexander and Heidi Swedberg stands as a stark, unforgiving exposure of the American television machine. It proves definitively that the Hollywood system operates without a single shred of genuine empathy. Talent, preparation, and quiet professionalism are absolutely meaningless if you do not belong to the protected ruling class of a production. This incident strips away the glamorous, funny facade of the entertainment industry. It reveals a ruthless corporate hierarchy where an A-list star's minor professional discomfort is valued significantly higher than a supporting actor's entire livelihood. The network executives and the core cast members demonstrated that they possess the power to not only terminate a career, but to transform that termination into a national joke. They weaponized their massive platform to execute a colleague, monetized her humiliation to the tune of billions of dollars, and spent 2 decades collecting the profits in complete silence. This is the ultimate chilling legacy of the situation. It forces the mature viewing audience to confront a highly uncomfortable reality about the media they consume to relax after a long day of work. The most beloved, critically acclaimed comedies are frequently manufactured in environments of intense grinding cruelty. The legacy of that specific sitcom will forever carry this permanent, undeniable stain. It serves as a lasting reminder that behind the brightest studio lights and the loudest recorded laughter, there is often a cold, unfeeling corporate machine perfectly willing to crush anyone who stands in the way of the leading man's ego.